KaNDy Neurons by Anika Divekar and
Meena S. Vontivillu.
Here we have a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron. Now let's talk about the individual parts.
First, we have the axon, which is modeled by the long Twizzler in the middle of our diagram. The axon is the long tail-like structure found on the neuron, and the function of the axon is to carry the signals between the dendrites, which are the nerve cell's input site, and the terminal buttons, which are the nerve cell's output site. The dendrites on our diagram is modeled by the small Twizzlers located around the lifesaver. The dendrites are the branch-like structures of the nerve cell that extends from the soma, and the function is to receive and communicate neural impulses from the tips of the neuron to the cell body.
Soma is represented by the purple and the clear lifesavers on our diagram. The soma is the cell body of a neuron which contains the nucleus of the nerve cell. It holds the cell's DNA and ensures that the cell is functioning properly. The terminal button is represented by the red Jolly Rancher on our diagram. It is the small, knob-like structure that is located at the end of the neuron. It contains the neurotransmitters which carry the neuron signal to the synapse.
The myelin sheath is represented by the candy corn covering the Twizzler on our diagram. The myelin sheath is the insulating layer that is located around the axons, and the function of the myelin sheath are to protect the axons and to facilitate the transmission of neural impulses. The neurotransmitters on our diagram are represented by the small pieces of candy corn. The neurotransmitters are chemical substances that are released by neurons, which carry information from one neuron to another.
The synaptic cleft on our diagram is the area that includes the green Skittles, the candy corns. It is the space between the terminal button and the dendrites of other cells in which impulses pass by release of neurotransmitters, which can then carry the impulse across the synapse to the next neuron. The synapse is the area labeled synapse. It is the gap between two nerve cells or a nerve cell and a muscle cell. The receptor sites are at the end of the short Twizzlers on one of our neurons. It is the protein on the surface of each cell, which acts like the ears of the cell by listening to the messages of the chemical messenger molecules that are in the intercellular fluid around the cell. Now Meena will talk about long-term potentiation, action potential, depolarization, the all or none principle, resting potential, and reuptake.
Long-term potentiation is an increase in a cell's firing potential after brief and rapid stimulation. It's also defined as the long-lasting strengthening of synapses between two nerve cells after repeated stimulation. Action potential in a neuron is a brief electrical impulse where information is transmitted through the axon. If depolarization, which is a reduction in the absolute value of membrane potential as the sodium channels are open and flood inside the cell, reaches the threshold, and action potential is created and the neuron will fire. Since long-term potentiation allows more ions to move into the cell, depolarization occurs faster and more rapidly. This is an example of the all-or-none principle, which states that a neuron reacts with full strength or no strength at all. The action potential is only one part of the entire sequence that must happen in order for long-term potentiation to occur, and when these happen at the same time or in the same time frame, long-term potentiation occurs. During long-term potentiation, the receptors in the dendrites increase, meaning the resting potential of the neurons will also increase, since sodium ions and calcium ions will have the ability to move faster in the neurons. A cell's resting potential is approximately negative 70 MV, and both the sodium and potassium channels are closed. The resting potential of the neurons increase during long-term potentiation because the receptors allow the ions inside and outside to bind and make electrical waves that travel down the axon, resulting in stronger electrical waves. Long-term potentiation will make reuptake, which is the neurotransmitter's reabsorption by sending the neuron, happen faster as the neuron releases more neurotransmitters.
The myelin sheath serves two purposes in the neurotransmitter process. The first is to encase and protect the axons, and the other is to greatly increase the speed of impulse transmissions through the neurons. At the juncture of the synapse, terminal buttons get close to the dendrite of another neuron in the gap between each cell, called a synaptic cleft. In this gap, neurotransmitters are active, and each neuron is transporting information with each other. It transmits the nerve impulse to the postsynaptic fiber by diffusing across the synaptic cleft and binding to receptor molecules on the postsynaptic membrane. The terminal button is named a terminal button because of its button-like shape and because it's at the end of the axon, which makes it final or terminal.
The presynaptic neuron is the neuron that fires the neurotransmitter as a result of an action potential entering its axon terminal, which is modeled by the structure located on the upper left side of our diagram. The postsynaptic neuron is the neuron on the right side of our diagram, and it is the neuron that receives the transmitter after it has crossed the synapse.